Come on. Okay, welcome everyone. Here we are. Thanks for being here for our closing keynote today. I'm super excited about this opportunity and just want to thank all the Health and Wellness Summit organizers for integrating this into the Health and Wellness Summit. We are bringing our speaker today through a grant with the Colorado Department of Public Safety. That grant was given to CU for our police department, the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence, and my office, which is Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance. I'm Teresa Rowe. I'm with OIEC. I'm our Assistant Vice Chancellor for Prevention Education. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Tiffany Ito, who will be our moderator for today's discussion with Dr. Jeff Cohen. So in terms of Tiffany's background, Tiffany is a professor of social psychology and neuroscience here at the CU Boulder campus. And her research really looks at belonging as well as it relates to academic achievement and adolescent substance use. And Dr. Ito has been colleagues with Dr. Cohen when he was here in 2006 through 2009. So I really appreciate her being here. She has been super critical to this work on our campus as well. So help me welcome Dr. Tiffany Ito.
Thank you, Teresa. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to remind you, you can visit the Health and Wellness Summit website for a survey about this session, and also the video from the session will be posted at some point as well. The way we're going to run this session today is we're going to begin with some opening remarks from our keynote speaker. Then he and I are going to have a little bit of a conversation here, and then we will be sure to save time at the end for questions from the audience. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Cohen, who is Professor of Psychology and the James G. March Professor of Organizational Studies in Education and Business at Stanford University. Dr. Cohen is an expert on sense of belonging, and he is author of the recent book, Belonging: The Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides. Professor Cohen's research examines the problems of communal existence and offers concrete solutions for improving our daily lives. As he will shortly tell us, we all have a fundamental need to belong, but most of us don't appreciate that need in other people. And as a result, we can inadvertently behave in ways that threaten other people's sense of belonging. But fortunately, there are small acts that we can do to establish connection. There are brief activities, such as reflecting on our core values, and a suite of practices that Dr. Cohen calls situation crafting that are helpful for decreasing political polarization, improving our performance at work and at school, combating racism, and improving health, well-being, and relationships. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Cohen.
Well, it is such a delight and honor to be here today with you. As you know, I used to be a professor here at Colorado many years ago, and I really feel like coming back here is like coming back home. I feel like I belong here. I forgot how clean, fresh air smells. So, you know, I just want to give a few brief introductory points. The work that I'm representing here, I'm much more of a representative than anything else. You can see me as a kind of curator. I've been studying this work now for decades. I run a lab, I do research, but what I'm going to be talking about, what we'll be talking about today, is a community effort, a community of scientists working together to just try to understand both human nature and human potential. The dilemma that we're dealing with is an American one, maybe a worldwide one right now, which is the dilemma of how to create a diverse and democratic society where all truly belong, both have the feeling of belonging and that reality is there too. It is such a challenge, especially in a society like ours that is as diverse as ours, with the wide range of sensitivities and sensibilities to create an inclusive society, an inclusive institution, for that matter, an inclusive social interaction. I mean, I find it even hard to have a true conversation where everyone feels like their voice is represented and that they're all being respected and included. This is the dilemma. This is the dilemma down on the ground every day. We deal with it in our daily lives. And what this research is all about, what the science is all about, is how to make the most of it. How to make the most of our social encounters, especially in a diverse world. How to make them places where collisions and conflicts are less likely and growth and learning are more likely. That's the vision. And I think we can do it. I think we can do it. I know we live in very difficult times. There are formidable forces out there trying to divide us. I know. Loneliness is at an all-time high, so high that our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, declared it to be a national crisis. Polarization, political polarization, is at a nearly all-time high. It's a very worrisome time. It's a very worrisome time for democracy, too, in general. So what do we do about it? Well, we need help from all quarters, for sure. And it's not going to change without, of course, structural and systemic reform. We are at an era, I know, of cultural reckoning, where systems of exclusion need to be dismantled. That is paramount. That is paramount. But at the same time, down on the ground every day, dealing with the cards that we've been dealt, we can make a difference, a positive difference, sometimes a small one, sometimes a big one. And I am just blown away by this research. I've been in this field, as I said, for many years, and I got into it because it was such an inspirational field, because it said, the way to change people, or to at least to support people, is to change their circumstances. And small tweaks and changes to the situation right here, right now, the one we share here together, can have large impacts. And that's the sort of vision of social psychology. And so the research we'll talk about today kind of just shows how this is possible, day to day, down on the ground in our social interactions. It's almost like a pragmatics of respect. How do you achieve it? And if you achieve respect, great things are possible. Remarkable accomplishments are within our reach. I really do believe that. So let me give you a couple examples. Here's, just actually 2 quick points. Belonging matters, and we can create it. That's the whole gist of what I'm saying. Belonging, just to give you a working definition, is that sense that we are part of a group that values and respects us and to which we can contribute. When we have that, it's almost like a magical state. We have that sense that there's people in our corner. And I kind of liken it to having a psychological perch. I love those old studies by Mary Ainsworth, the developmental psychologist, where she found that the little infants in a strange situation, a room filled with toys, what did they do? Well, I'm going to simplify it. They fell into 2 categories. There were the infants that wandered off and explored and tinkered with the toys. And then there were the infants who cuddled close to their caregiver, usually their mother in these studies. And the big difference between those 2 types of kids was whether they were securely attached to their caregiver. Now, you might think having a secure attachment might mean you stay physically close to the person you love, but that's not what she found. She found that when you have that secure attachment, you people feel safer to greet and meet the strange situation, the challenges before them. It is like a psychological perch from which the kind of unfamiliarities and difficulties loom a little bit less large. And I really feel like that analogy captures what it's like to have a sense of belonging at a place, in a school, in a country, in a community. You have the feeling that there's people in your corner. You feel big. You feel lifted up. And the research supports this. Just to give one example of many, the work from the Harvard group led by Waldinger has found that, when you look at elderly people in a lot of pain, those who are in a lot of pain have worse well-being if they have poor social connections. But the ones who report having very good social connections, pain doesn't undermine their well-being as much. It's as if from that perch, problems feel a little less formidable. Now, I know that today it's a very difficult world we live in. The problems, especially facing students today, require a lot of courage for the students and for teachers and for all of us. But I think always the solution remains the same. We get through it together with other people. And we can create it down on the ground in the minutia of everyday life. And the research supports this. We'll probably get into a bit more. Now, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll give you just a couple examples. These are anecdotes. I love, one of the rewards of writing a book is you get to see readers appreciating what you write from a point of view you never thought of. And as one reader said, you know, what this is showing is that, this research is showing is that belonging can be found and created, not just found, in the most unlikely of places. And I think that really captures it. I wish I had come up with that. So, anecdote, story, begins with stories. I love stories. Stories show what's possible, the frontiers of human possibility. This is Steve. He's not using a divining rod. He's actually probing for water depth. He's a soil scientist, very successful businessman. But he grew up in very harsh circumstances out in Ohio in a farm family. And his family was always on the verge of losing the farm. So they were in precarity. And Steve felt like there's no way I'm getting out of this situation, this circumstance. And for sure, his future looked bleak. He didn't do well in school. He got in a lot of trouble. But then, in the third grade, he met Mrs. Zinn, his third grade teacher. She had a commanding voice. She scared people, he said. And she studied him. She noticed. She bestowed loving attention. I think this is all about paying attention to the people in front of him. Respect. Respect means to respectate, to look again, look closer. She studied me. She knows, wait a minute, he's getting the answers right when it's a worksheet, but wrong when it's on the board. Maybe he needs glasses. So she got him glasses. And then he started to excel. Attention. And she said I could do more than become a farmer. She saw that I had abilities that I did not know I had. She saw more in me than I believed I had, and demanded more of me than I thought I could give. She was the spark who made me believe in me. This is why we use this as sort of metaphor of the umbrella and describe this where it's like, as bad as the storm is, he's growing up in poverty, still a relationship can make all the difference. Even an encounter can make a huge difference. And this was one case where it did. Mrs. Zinn convinced him that he really could belong in school. And she made all the difference, changed his destiny. Now, this is just an anecdote, but what I'm really interested in is the science of this. Can we create this not just with one particular person? Maybe it was just something about Steve, but is this like what we call a replicable effect? And with my colleagues, Claude Steele, David Yeager, Val Purdy, Greenaway, we did a little study I'll just tell you about real quick. I don't want to use up too much time here, where we had students in the 7th grade write an essay. They wrote an essay for their teacher. And the teacher gave comments, critical feedback on the kids' essays. And these were students of color who, like Steve, may sometimes feel like they don't belong in school, as Claude Steele showed, because of negative stereotypes about them and the experiences that they have with microaggressions and discrimination in school. Then, for a random half of the students, we gave them this note, handwritten by their teacher. I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards and I know that you can meet them. So this was kind of going above and beyond the business as usual situation, beyond what the usual encouragement that teachers gave. It was an affirmation that I believe in you and you have potential. And in fact, the comments, this is what we call kind of wise intervention. This note reframes the meaning of critical feedback so that now it's not a judgment of you, it's an affirmation of my belief in you. So it inverts the meaning of the critical feedback. So here we're just looking at the percentage of students who revised their essays. In the control group, 17% revised their essay. And in the group that got this note, 72% did. One note made that difference. One note made that difference. It was as if what the note did was to help suspend the learned expectations that the students may have had about mistrust and whether they don't belong for a moment so that they could trust the feedback and really show what they were capable of. Now, this gets a little more mysterious and magical. Years later, actually we found the following year that the students who got this one note from their teacher, by the way, I'm sparing you a lot of methodological details. This is all blind. The teacher's blind to condition. We appended the notes in advance, so we're getting a pure causal read on the effect of the note. The following year, we found that in 8th grade, the students got in less disciplinary trouble in school. It was roughly halved. Because you can think about it. If I feel like I belong, then I'm less likely to act out. And the research supports this. When people feel unsure about whether they're respected, that's when aggression and sometimes violence can happen. When I know I belong and these are the people I care about, I'm less likely to lash out. Which makes you think, actually, when we see aggression and violence in the real world, we're often thinking, oh, that's something bad about their character. But sometimes it's a symptom of an underlying cause. Uncertainty about one's belonging. And if we address that underlying cause, especially proactively, we can have big effects. Big effects on even very difficult and even antisocial behavior. So that was in the 8th grade. And then many, many years later, we found that the students who received this note were more likely to go to college, whereas only 40% who got the regular feedback from their teacher went to college. Those who got this affirming note, 70% went to a 4-year college. As I've done this work, I've kind of come to see that, you know, these opportunities to connect and make a difference, they probably abound in our day-to-day lives. They're probably passing us by all the time, and many of these opportunities are missed. Many of these opportunities are missed. We have the power in some places and sometimes to change a destiny, as was done here, but was done with Mrs. Zinn and Steve. Not always. I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. I'm not saying a note is the solution to all our problems in school. It's not. We need school reform and material resources, human resources, but in those circumstances where opportunity is available, giving kids, giving people that affirmation that I believe in you, I see you, you belong, can make all the difference. That's an example of how connection, the power of connection in an unlikely place. Here's just one more I'll talk about real quick. This, you might know, this is C.P. Ellis and Ann Atwater. And this is an amazing story featured in a movie and a book by the title The Best of Enemies. Here they're the best of friends, but this is after a long, long history. They were both civil rights activists. C.P. Ellis, who's on your right, and Ann Atwater. I'll make a long story short. They became the best of friends. They worked together in the civil rights era. But C.P. Ellis used to be the exalted cyclops of the KKK. And he describes how the KKK lured him in because he was feeling defeated and like he didn't belong in America. He felt betrayed by the American dream. He felt isolated. And the KKK promised him or offered him a source of belonging. And as he described, when I knelt down before that altar to be inducted into the KKK, I felt like someone who mattered. I felt like someone who mattered. But then, through a series of fortuitous events, CP befriended Ann in a charrette where they worked together in common purpose to address a pressing social issue, whether to integrate their schools, the schools in Durham, North Carolina. And by working together for common purpose, they forged a friendship. And they engaged in respectful conversations that transformed CP, such that at the end of this experience, CP famously tore up his KKK membership card and voted in favor of integration. The power of a friendship, the power of a conversation, is this something special about CP and Ann? No. Actually, there's some wonderful research by David Brookman and Josh Kalla showing the power of respectful conversations. I'll make it just a long story short, but what they did was to go door to door in the most conservative districts in Florida to talk about a controversial issue in the area that most oppose transgender rights. They had a 10-minute conversation, and as a result of that 10-minute conversation, the voters increased dramatically in their support for transgender rights. And in fact, the voters were even more likely to take a stand against anti-transgender propaganda later on as a result of a 10-minute conversation. In fact, this 10-minute conversation produced as much change in attitude as did 10 years in America produce a change in support for gay and lesbian rights. That change in gay and lesbian rights from 1998 to 2014 was equivalent to the change in support for transgender individuals accomplished as a result of this 10-minute conversation. What did they do? They used a lot of science-backed approaches to create a state of openness, to open people's hearts and minds to a point of view that they hadn't considered. They did three things overall. First, they affirmed the other person. Actually, one of the things these conversations are noteworthy for is for what they did not do. They did not, the canvassers did not bombard the voters with arguments about how insensitive they were or how wrong they were. They didn't. They affirmed. First, they put the voters in an empowered position. They said, you could make a difference here. There is an upcoming vote for legislation to protect transgender rights, and you could make a difference. So they affirmed them, empowered them. They connected with the voters. So small things, but small things matter. They took off their sunglasses if they were wearing them. They made good eye contact. They asked questions of the voter and shared stories and listened to the answer. They connected. And after all of that, after affirming and connecting, they challenged. How did they challenge? Well, they did it in a kind of counterintuitive way. They challenged their hearts, not so much their minds. What they did, the canvassers did, was to pose the voter with a question. They said, you know what? We all feel like outsiders sometimes. We all feel judged and treated unfairly for who we are sometimes. Ironically, it's kind of like the one thing that unites us, that feeling of being different. Can you tell me about a time when you felt excluded because of something about you? And then the voters opened up. As one resident recalled, he was a soldier in Iraq, and he came down with PTSD. And as a result of having PTSD, he couldn't get a job. And he was so upset that people were drawing conclusions about his character and his potential based on this single fact about him. That opened the door to his heart, which opened his mind to the arguments about why this was such an important issue. And it was through this combination of scientifically grounded principles that the canvassers created dramatic change. By creating this connection, they opened the doors for change. So, sorry about that. I just want to end by saying I do feel like what all of this work says is, in spite of everything, all the forces that divide us, which we are kind of continuing to address, in spite of all that, every day, in even the smallest of encounters, we can make a difference through the words we choose, through the actions we make, and sometimes we might just change a destiny. Not always. We're not going to always make the change we hope to make, but once in a while we might, and a lot of times we may never know. But I do believe that if we all do this, if we all have this kind of hope, and I know hope is not a strategy, but I think the research gives us strategies for achieving the hopes we have, this vision of a world where all belong, from all walks of life. If we all have this vision and we all have an understanding of the wisdom and the pragmatics of how to navigate this diverse world, I really do feel like it could change the world. I really do believe that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. I now have the pleasure of asking you some additional questions. I thought I would begin at the beginning.
Yeah.
And in your book, you use the term crisis of belonging.
Yeah.
And so I was hoping you could say a little bit more about, of all the things we could be focusing on, why we should be focusing on belonging.
Yeah, that term crisis of belonging comes from Pete Buttigieg, who coined the term.
Are you
Is my
on?
mic on? I feel like I'm not.
You might just need to move it up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Is that good? Oh, there we go. Is that good? Yeah. Thanks. So Pete Buttigieg coined the term crisis of belonging. Of course, there's many culprits, underlying causes to the problems that we're dealing with today. But I do think, and I think the research suggests that, like, one sort of nodal construct to think about is belonging. We all have this need to belong, and the research suggests that that need begins in the cradle and continues to the grave. We have that throughout our lives. It's the kind of lesson of psychology, psychological science. So it's a fundamental need that, when defeated, leads to all kinds of trouble. Aggression, for instance. People who are isolated. That's one of the big predictors of aggression and future violence. Mental health. From the Harvard study, one of the big predictors of health and wellness and longevity are your social connections. And in addition, when people feel like they're disconnected, they're less likely to learn and persist in the face of difficulty. There's some research I know that you do, Tiffany, demonstrating that belonging. If you just ask people, how much do you belong in STEM, or how much do you belong in college, it proves to be one of the big predictors of retention. So it is a kind of nodal construct from which many symptoms spring. And I do worry that as we're trying to address the so many problems in our world, from polarization to hate crimes to discrimination, of course we need systemic reform. Structural reform is the most paramount. At the same time, understanding that a lot of the problems come from people's sense that they're disconnected from their community or from their families, can give us some leverage in addressing these problems. It's like one lever that we can pull that turns on many lights.
Awesome, thank you. And so I think that raises the question of thinking more about where each person's sense of belonging comes from. And in your answer, I think you were kind of talking about some of the broader forces. So if you could just, share some thoughts on what contributes to a person's sense of belonging, and also what role things like historical and cultural and social factors play.
Well, belonging is both a noun and a verb, right, Jaron? So belonging it's also a process. We're kind of continually navigating it, sort of visiting and revisiting the question, do I belong here? So it's an ongoing process that probably never ends, and it's always situated. It always kind of depends, what do we belong to? What do we want to belong to? It could be school, it could be a workplace, it could be family, it could be a community. So it's an ongoing process, and depending on the context, it could be determined by many things. But first and foremost, it's affected by connections, by feeling like you are respected and accepted, and that it's sort of not really contingent on your subscribing to a particular belief system or being a certain kind of person. It's that sense you get when you are regarded and believed in and respected for who you are. And that can come from multiple sources. Culturally, one of the big predictors of belonging in the workplace and in school is just experiencing discrimination and bias, right? So that is one critical place to start at the institutional societal level, is cracking down on discrimination and bias, increasing diversity, because one of the things that determines belonging is, are there people like me here? So increasing diversity in leadership positions, all of that is fundamental and among the most important things to change in trying to diversify our institutions. So that's, and then just, there's so many other things. I think one of the things we often ignore is just the kind of day-to-day quality of our interactions. There's some really exciting research showing that guess what? Rudeness is toxic in the workplace. And so there's these studies, for instance, by an Israeli group showing that, one rude comment makes doctors and nurses perform better. Or, sorry, perform worse. Perform worse. I got that wrong. Perform worse. And also rudeness spreads like contagion through the workplace. And then there's some research showing that if you do these field experiments in the workplaces to treat managers, respectful interaction, like here's how you do it, use participatory processes, ask people questions, listen to the answers, really get to know your staff, really get to know your employees, work collaboratively rather than being authoritarian. Kind of seems a little obvious. Now, I know it's not rocket science, but most people don't do it. They find these whopping effects on retention. So that's just a constellation of things that really matter.
Great.
The most obvious things, I guess this is one thing I've been thinking. Sometimes the most obvious things are the things that matter the most. Just kind of being there, being available, conveying appreciation, gratitude. Obvious things matter a lot. But they're the first things to go by the wayside when we feel like we disagree or when we sense a difference or divide. Research by Jennifer Eberhardt shows that, for instance, white police officers, actually just police officers in general, when interacting with black drivers, are less polite, less respectful. Difference prevents us from making these obvious gestures. Ego threat, it's the first thing to go. When we feel under threat, politeness goes out the window. So the obvious things matters, but they're very hard to maintain, I think, especially in potentially divisive and diverse societies like ours.
I wanted to ask you about stereotype threat. You mentioned discrimination earlier in that answer, and so it made me think of stereotype threat. So if you could say a little bit about what stereotype threat is and how that relates to belonging.
Stereotype threat is a term coined by Claude Steele, my mentor, and his colleagues, and it refers to the concern we may all have in situations where we feel like we could be seen through the lens of a negative stereotype. And we all experience it. Like me, sometimes I feel like back home I could be seen as like that pencil-necked, naive academic, right? And we can feel that social image of ourselves afoot in the minds of others. We all experience this, but it is devastating in its consequences when it's chronic, as many students from historically negatively stereotyped groups may experience. For instance, Black students in school, Latino American students in school, women in STEM. The concern about being judged in light of negative stereotypes about my ethnic group or my gender group can be chronic. And the research suggests that that can be pretty deleterious to well-being, to motivation, and to performance. So Claude did those elegant studies showing that when Black college students took a standardized test, and they were told this test measures your ability, your intellectual ability, they did worse than white students, substantially worse than white students, controlling for their prior SAT scores. But when they told another group, this test has absolutely nothing to do with your intellectual ability, but it was the same objective test, then Black and white students performed equally, again, controlling for their prior SAT score. So this shows how just shuttering out the stereotype from the situation, saying this has nothing to do with intellectual ability or stereotypes about intellectual ability, lifted the performance of Black students on this test so that they could really show what they know. And that's just a demonstration of the power of this effect. Now, pulling the camera back, what does this tell us? I really believe that what this research tells us is something like a fundamental bit of wisdom, which is the same situation can be seen very differently. Every situation is, in fact, many situations, as many situations as the number of people in it. So the same test, same standardized test, for a white student seems like this is just a standardized test. It's a kind of academic ritual. But for a negatively stereotyped student, it may be freighted with potential threat. So this really makes you think more about the challenge of creating a society where all belong. It's like, now I have to think about not just my point of view, how I'm seeing the situation, but how other people are seeing the situation, which can often be, as we know in this era, so different from our own. And I think what stereotype threat drives home is that fundamental bit of wisdom that the situation as you see it may be very different from the situation as other people see it. And so the task of creating truly inclusive institutions requires us to be very sophisticated and very empathic and very willing to explore the perspectives of the people we're trying to support so that we understand their experience, because it may not be what we think it is.
So I wanted to pick up on in the research you were talking about on stereotype threat, the message there is low belonging caused by stereotype threat is associated with poor outcomes. So the reverse of that is high belonging is good. But is it always associated with just positive outcomes? Are there negative outcomes that we can get from a sense of high belonging?
Yeah, there actually is. As I was describing with CPLs, when people have a defeated need to belong, they're very vulnerable to the appeals of hate groups that promise them, or extremist groups that that offer them an alternative source of belonging. This is research by Ari Kruglansky and others demonstrating that a lot of times people join extremist groups not because they subscribe to their racist ideologies, but because they just want to feel like there's a place where I can belong. And they feel that in these groups. I kind of think it's like faux belonging because it's really a kind of contingent belonging. They have to subscribe to these beliefs and sometimes do awful things in order to belong. So I don't think it's an authentic belonging. But it is an example of where that need to belong can get us into trouble. It can kind of channel us or shunt us in some pretty harmful directions. So that's one example. Then there's a recent study that I thought was very interesting, demonstrating how feeling belonging to your country is not really, they don't call it belonging, it's like you're having that sense that my country and I are one. That generally predicts positive attitudes towards outgroups, but if the outgroup seems threatening, like immigrants, I had a negative interaction with immigrants, then a high sense of belonging is actually predictive of more negative, makes people more negative towards outgroups. So it's not always a positive thing. Belonging needs to be sort of channeled in constructive directions. And I think the bottom line is one has to create communities and institutions where belonging is achieved by working together for higher purposes, common purposes, and especially inclusive purposes.
Great. Can you say more, in your example with the KKK, a drive to belong there was leading to some dangerous and negative behaviors. What are the warning signs that that's happening? And then how can we use that to help us prevent things like radicalization and hate crimes?
I think fear and isolation, those are the big predictors. Fear and isolation. Feeling humiliated, feeling ostracized, feeling left out, feeling left behind. Those are all toxins. So let's call them psychological toxins. They come from lived experiences. But those are the ones. And I think that gives us a little leverage in trying to create workplaces and schools and communities is to think very hard. I mean, first, to kind of use that as a warning sign, right? Isolation especially. David Brooks just wrote this article, Why Are Americans So Mean? And there's a line in there that really resonated, it stuck with me. Lonely times are violent times. And so I think being on alert for individuals or groups or trends in isolation and also resentment is really key, really key. And you can do that through surveys, through climate assessments at an institutional level. Vivek Murthy, I really commend him on the job he's doing, drawing national attention to the disconnection from a humanity that so many people feel. And then I also do think that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think sometimes we spend too much time thinking about how we can identify like the bad apples and not enough time thinking about, well, how can we create situations that are more conducive to the kinds of behavior that we want to see? How do we create situations that include people and make them feel part of the institution, the university, that involve them? And if you can do that early, strike, before the die is cast, then you can have these very large and long-term effects. And just to give one example, some research I know that maybe has been conducted here as well on sharing stories of vulnerability. For instance, in an institutional setting, having senior students disclose to junior incoming freshmen their struggles and their vulnerabilities. When I came to college, I felt isolated. I felt like I didn't belong. But here's how I found my niche. And with time, it got better. So if you're feeling out of place and you're feeling isolated, it's normal. Here's some steps you can take to get some help. And this, I don't like the term intervention, but it's called the social belonging intervention. It's been found to really be very, very helpful to people in colleges, in workplaces, increasing retention, improving well-being, and even physical health. So I think even these little preventative measures, we often think about big solutions, but I think little preventative measures, creating these moments of shared interaction and shared vulnerability. Brene Brown had it right a little bit here, like shared vulnerability brings people closer, as long as it's in a kind of safe space.
So my next question then, I'm going to pick up on those, the social belonging intervention that you talked about. So I'm going to ask you about what you have called wise interventions.
Yeah.
You mentioned it a little bit in your intro. So can you explain more about what the hallmarks are of a wise intervention and how you think those can have effects on belonging? Like in the example that you cited with the essay, where in 8th grade they get a message that the student believes in them, and then you say in college, there's outcomes that differ for those groups in college, and you said that the effects were kind of mysterious and magical. And I know, of course, we actually know we know how that's happening, but it does seem pretty mysterious. It's something, one little note in 8th grade can have an effect on you when you're 20 or so. So if we can talk about that.
Yeah, I would say that, so two things. One, wise interventions are interventions that reassure people that they're being seen with dignity, fundamentally. They are wise to, they kind of get it. It's like wise to your experience. It was actually a term used by the gay subculture of the 1950s. They used it to refer to straight people who, in spite of the widespread demonization of homosexuality, straight people who saw them for who they were, saw their full humanity. That's what the term wise meant. And then Irving Goffman, my favorite sociologist, he co-opted it to refer to individuals who, in interactions with people who have been historically mistreated or negatively viewed, convey a faith in their humanity. And that's what wise means, and that's what wise interventions accomplish in a very, very small way. So I really believe that what we need is more wise teachers, wise mentors, wise leaders, wise presidents, right? People who convey to us that they believe in us and see us and support us, right? But the interventions, I don't, again, like the term intervention, but let's call them practices. The practices like the feedback, the wise feedback, I believe in your potential to reach a higher standard, the active listening, deep canvassing that Brookman and Kala do, and many, many others, the shared stories, those are all kind of compressed experiences that help people in a moment to feel seen and valued and supported. And sometimes the littlest thing can make the biggest difference. There's a study by Mott and Carter where they looked, for example, at one wise intervention, which was just sending postcards to suicide patients. People had attempted to commit suicide after they exited the hospital. And they sent them postcards for the next 4 years. And the postcards just said, hey, we're just checking in on you. How are you doing? If you want, write us back. Tell us what's going on. We care was the message. We see you. And they found that halved the suicide reattempt rate, that little intervention. So wise interventions are ones that help people to feel seen, believed in, supported, seen with respect. Respect, seen, fully seen. And once in a while, as I conveyed there, that can make all the difference. So there are these points of high leverage where a little bit of support can go a long way. That study I talked about, that was in the 7th grade. Key transition, fork in the road, where too many kids go on a negative path. If you can introduce a positive experience at that moment, you can send kids off on a different trajectory. You can send any individual off on a different trajectory. Key points of vulnerability are windows of opportunity where this even brief support can make a big difference, like the sharing stories for first-year students coming to college in that first-year transition. These are examples of how in certain times, in certain places, a little action, a little intervention can have a big effect. But if you intervene too late, the die may be cast. So timing is so key. And the research bears this out, that what you really want to do is give people the support they need when they need it. And when the right person receives the right support at the right time, that's when a turning point can happen. And that's why empathy, I think, is so important. This is why perspective getting is so important. Finding out about the people you're trying to help so that you know, okay, these are the points of vulnerability. These are the points of difficulty, and here's how I can intervene. That's what the approach, I would call it not a wise intervention, but a wise, let's call it wisdom. Wisdom. Wisdom of support. Pragmatics of support. So, so.
Great. So there's a lot of good ideas there, and I think it's really key what you're talking about delivering that information at critical periods. So now I want to keep you talking about other ideas by asking you about what you call situation crafting in your book. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah.
And maybe how it differs from those other kinds of programs you talked about?
So situation crafting is the verb, wise interventions are the noun. They're what you use, right? Crafting situations, that's a term that refers to the act of creating circumstances, experiences that help people to feel seen and supported. That's pretty much it, crafting situations. And the reason I use that term is because I borrow this idea from one of my other mentors, Lee Ross, the power of the situation. One of the big lessons of social science is the power of the situations we're in. Right here, right now, the circumstances. We in the West have this delusion that we think that what really matters in driving people's behavior is their personality or their ability. We're way too quick to assume that a kid who's performing poorly must lack some ability, or that someone who said something a little objectionable must have some character flaw. Way too quick. Circumstance matters a lot. Here's one of my favorite examples. Long story short, you come in to play an economic game, one of these economic games where you can snatch all the money for yourself, I'm simplifying, or share it with the other player. What determines cooperative play? The name of the game. If the experimenter refers to this game as the community game, 70% of players cooperate. They share the pot. If the experimenter calls it the Wall Street game, 70% of people snatch the bucket for themselves. And they find in this study that people's reputation as a cooperative or greedy SOB, as rated by their peers, has no predictive value at all. So, power of context. We really are miscalibrated in this culture. I can't overstate that. We just way too often think that we're getting a read on people when really we're getting a read on the effects of the circumstances that they're contending with. And that kind of requires constant re-reminding. And so situation crafting re-empowers the individual because we are part of every situation we are in, which gives us some power too. The opposite of great truth is also true, Niels Bohr said. Situation is powerful, but we share some of the power as part of every situation we're in. Give one quick example of situation crafting. Rosenthal and Jacobson did this wonderful study where years and years ago, it's been subsequently replicated, where they simply gave their teachers, gave elementary school teachers a bit of information about some of their students. they told the teachers that a handful of their students in their class would be intellectual bloomers, meaning that they took a test and guess what? These kids are going to show a lot of intellectual growth across the course of the year. But guess what? They didn't know that these kids, these earmarked kids, were actually randomly identified. They weren't really special. But they found at the end of the year that the kids who have been so labeled gained more in their IQ scores. Their IQ scores actually went up. That's amazing. That is amazing. What it says is that those teachers changed, as part of those kids' situation, changed their kids' ability to learn. The teachers were part of the kids' situation, and as a result of that intervention, created a classroom environment that was more conducive to their learning. And I do feel, and the research kind of suggests this, these kind of self-fulfilling prophecies play out all the time. If I had that faith that there's something in you worth knowing more about, so much more can come and grow from that. In the Brookman and College deep canvassing study, I mentioned, right, they train the canvassers and they tell them, just assume that your goal here, just assume that everyone you meet has something interesting to say, and your goal is to draw it out. So I think that the power of the situation is the lesson of social science. Situation crafting seeds some of that agency back into ourselves, and the opposite of great truth is also true. The individual can be powerful, can make a big difference.
Right. So picking up on talking about situation crafting and wise interventions, can you talk about how that might help us to prevent harm and violence? Easy question.
Yeah. Well, again, I think these proactive measures that bring people together in common purpose and community, that's so essential. That's so essential. Involving kids together, for instance, in schools, in joint activities where they cooperate in pursuit of common goals. That's been found to reduce prejudice and improve relationships and friendships across racial lines, even during the civil rights era when schools could be pretty divisive. So I would say, first and foremost, probably one of the best wise interventions ever created is contact, cooperation between groups in pursuit of common goals, bringing people together across lines of difference. So that, I think, is key. Just creating opportunities. And there's even research that's showing very simple things like bringing people together from different religious or racial groups to have one-on-one conversations where they talk about things together and get to know each other. That can improve relations and reduce hostilities across racial lines and across religious lines. So that would be first and foremost, to create those opportunities for working together in common purpose. Reducing also segregation between groups. I believe that segregation is a toxin that really exacerbates hostility. Human mind is so imaginative. And if we begin with fear, I think that group is fearsome, it's threatening, then our imagination starts spinning these very paranoid theories that, if they're not checked, can really kind of go off the rails. So contact is so key in preventing these problems of radicalization. Then I think when radicalization has happened, I think looking at, and people have already kind of progressed far down the wrong road, the work by Ari Kruglansky is really useful, showing that if you involve even people who seem lost in dialogues with people, much like the Brookman and College, respectful dialogues, that's one thing that can bring them back. Also, by the way, I also should give a shout out for growth mindset. Growth mindsets, a lot of aggression happens because I think this person is bad and they're going to stay bad and I need to teach them a lesson. Or maybe I'm a problem and I just feel ashamed, and so then I lash out because I'm feeling ashamed. Growth mindset interventions, research by David Jager, Carol Dweck, and others, have been found to be pretty effective at reducing aggression in schools. Peer-to-peer exclusion. So those are very effective, those growth mindset. Basically teaching people that we are all works in progress rather than finished products. And that can go a long way to preventing violence. And then I should also give another shout out to work by Elizabeth Pawlik, where she goes into these schools and, to make a long story short, essentially creates these little breakfast clubs, if anyone's a fan of the old John Hughes movie, where people of different cliques get together, maybe 10 in a school, to talk about the problems in their school. And they work together under adult democratic guidance to find solutions to make their schools better, more welcoming spaces. And she finds pretty sizable effects, for instance, cutting the suspension rates by a third at the schools where she intervenes.
You have talked in a couple of your answers about empathy and also one-on-one dialogue, so I want to ask you a little bit more about that. It seems like one of the lessons in your book is about the benefit of those kinds of very personalized conversations and interactions. And if you agree that those are beneficial, do you have any thoughts on why those kinds of conversations are so hard to have, and what we
I've
can
wondered all about it. It's a great question.
to help people have these kind of tough conversations?
Well, I'm a fan of this research by Liz Dunn and Gillian Sandstrom, showing yes, it's really, again, it's not rocket science. They find that even just making eye contact with someone, they do these field studies where you're walking down the street, someone makes eye contact with you, then they measure your feelings of connected, and you feel more connected, right? Or Nick Epley's research, you talk to a stranger on a train and you don't think it's going to be fun, but actually you feel better. You feel pretty good about making that connection. You get a little dopamine blast because that's kind of how we're wired to connect. And then just another example, expressing gratitude. Some research by Sarah Algiers showing that when people express gratitude for their spouses, it has these amazing effects. They feel better about one another. They spend more time with one another. I think she finds an hour more a day. Gratitude, expressing gratitude, random acts of kindness. So why don't we do more of these obvious things? You could call it the Stevie Wonder effect, right? That's old Stevie Wonder song. I just called to say I love you, right? I know it sounds corny, but that stuff works. But why don't we do that? So maybe 3 reasons off the cuff. One is affective forecasting errors. We just kind of get it wrong. We're not really, aware of how important connection is to our well-being, and so we don't act with wisdom in promoting our own well-being by doing these things. So that's one, affective forecasting. Epley finds that consistently people really underestimate the impact of expressing gratitude or giving someone a compliment. They think it's not going to make much of a difference for the other person, but it actually does. Let's not forget the media and some of our political figures who monetize fear and outrage. Fear, outrage. I mean, we social psychologists discovered the power of fear and outrage. It's clickbait. So it's been used for mercenary purposes to keep us fearful of one another. And so social mistrust has gone way down, right? It used to be, I think, most Americans, about 2/3 of them trusted other people back in, I think, the 1960s, and now it's down to roughly 1/3 of Americans trust. Social mistrust is way down. I think it's partly the media is to blame, which just is really hard to trust and reach out and make yourself vulnerable when you think that other people may do you harm, right? So let's think. So the media, and then these biases that we all have. The third one, the biases we all have, stereotypes, the perception of difference, the fundamental attribution error, right? The tendency to blame people rather than situations. Ego threat, right? All these things like stereotypes, ego threat, tendency to blame people, make it less likely that we're going to reach out and try to establish that bond in certain situations, especially when the other person seems like an other, especially when we feel offended or threatened or feel like the other person is challenging our views. And also in our day-to-day life, these biases really divide us when we're feeling stressed and overworked and hurried. So I think those kinds of biases are like fuel for division. And they get really exacerbated in our modern busy lifestyle because they're the first things to go, these little niceties, these gestures of respect, politeness, which is so universal. Politeness is universal. All cultures in the world have it. This is a universal way to say, I see you. I recognize your humanity. But politeness, all these things, first thing to go out the window when we're feeling stressed, busy, overworked, threatened, when we feel on the defensive. So those would be my answers.
All right, I'm looking at the clock and I want to save time for the audience to ask questions. So I will make this my last question to you, and I'm going to end with something I think of particular relevance to the students on campus here. So young adult and teen mental health. And in your book, you talked about Humanity Crew and Spiegel's research on cancer patients. You also talked about the toxicity of loneliness and the role that social connections play in health. And so I wonder if you could talk about how that kind of work might help us to understand teens and young adults who are struggling with mental health issues.
Well, social connections going down worldwide for teens. Jean Twenge has a study showing worldwide decreases in social belonging at school. So I think that, there's many stresses on students today. And one of the big culprits, perhaps, is not having those authentic connections. As I recall, teens today spend 40 hours less per week with their friends in person than they did 30 years ago. Instead, they're online and using social media. I don't think social media is the whole culprit here, but I think it's part of the problem because it's like you're getting kind of cheap calories of connection. They're kind of filling in the short term. You get like a little dopamine blast, but it's not the kind of connection that is fulfilling that you often get from these one-on-one conversations with people, where you're not putting up a facade as people often do in these online social media settings. So I do think that encouraging students and creating more opportunities for them to work together, see each other, work together in common purpose, volunteer service programs have these remarkable effects on the mental health and the physiological health of teens. If they're just randomly assigned to participate in a volunteer program, their health and their happiness goes up. So creating opportunities for teens to connect, youth to connect, I think that's really essential. Another easier thing to do, I mean, maybe not, I don't think that's hard, but one other thing to do that I also want to call out is really encouraging ourselves. All of this is kind of for ourselves and for others, but really encouraging people at these key moments of development, like the teenage years, to visit and revisit their core values. So who are you, right? What do you stand for? What do you believe in? That is the question of the teen years, right? And this is the moment when you're deciding it. And of course, you're going to be able to change it. It's not written in stone. But I don't think that kids get asked that question that much. What is your purpose? What do you want to devote yourself to? What is your higher calling, the torch you want to burn brightly for? And there's some research, as you know, by many showing the impact of these activities. They're called values affirmation activities, where you simply give kids, especially, but anyway, it works for all of us, a moment, like a psychological timeout to just jot down a few thoughts about, what's your most important value? Maybe it's relationships, maybe it's creativity, maybe it's compassion. Just identify it, and then write a few sentences about why that's important to you. And I've been reading Bell Hooks, her book about belonging, which is excellent. And, it really resonates with me. She describes being at Stanford, not feeling like she belonged, but she would have these like little totems, like a tobacco leaf from her country, from Kansas, or a blanket from her grandma that just reminded her of where she came from and her family and her community and its values. And she said, this is like my little stand against the larger negative forces in my life, the forces coming in saying to value this when I don't really value that, or the forces saying I'm not really valued myself when I really do feel like I'm valued. So these value affirmation activities are a small version of a bigger truth, which is giving people the opportunity to identify, reflect on, and live out their core values, whatever they may be. That is probably the most important thing I could recommend for health. And we found in our lab and many others that it even helps reduce the symptomology of cancer patients. It improves the physiological health of teenagers, and it even helps people to, David Creswell finds, perform under pressure so that they have less stress hormone cortisol when they're giving an evaluative talk. If they just kind of take a step back and remind themselves, what's my important value? It's as if they're lifted up onto a higher perch, and the moment ends up not fully defining them. And thinking about your values is a really key way to do that, I think. This is one last point, like Matt McConaughey, I'm going to say his name wrong, has this great book, Green Lights. So he says one thing that really stuck with me. He's like, when you choke and stress out, that happens when you're giving more credit to a person, place, or time than you are to yourself. And so values affirmations are a way of kind of returning value to yourself, and those giving more credit to yourself in those moments where you might otherwise feel diminished.
Great. I was not expecting to get pearls of wisdom about belonging from Matthew McConaughey, so very enlightening.
Good book.
Are you ready to take some
Yeah,
questions
please.
from the audience?
Yes.
So I think we have some microphones. And yes, if anybody has any questions for Dr. Cohen.
Hi. I was just wondering if you've done any studying on neurodiverse and how situation crafting might be different for people who are on the autism spectrum or ADHD or something like that.
Oh, that's such a great question. I don't know of any research on that. Unfortunately, I think it's such a great research topic. I really don't know of any research, but I think that some of the same ideas would apply, that it's very important for people to be seen as individuals rather than as just a kind of another member of a category. And I would think many of the practices, these sort of wise interventions, could be effective in those for those groups too. But I don't know as much about it. There was one study with the visually impaired by one of my former students, Ariel Silverman, where she found that giving values affirmation activities to the visually impaired at one of these learning centers where they learn how to sort of manage day-to-day tasks, that it's for younger visually impaired students, that those values affirmation activities improved their performance, their grades in the school. So that's one tidbit of evidence that a kind of similar practice might matter there. I think stereotypes too really play out. Years and years ago, there was a famous Russian psychologist, Lev Vygotsky, who did this work showing that when teachers try to teach, I think it was kids with learning disabilities, they end up often doing more harm than good because they cater to their presumed deficiencies by kind of giving them like really kind of easy look and see activities. And the more effective approach turns out to be challenging the kids, at the upper bound of what he called the zone of proximal development, that kind of upper bound of their potential. Like find out how far they can travel and kind of aim the instruction there. So that's another line of research that I think is very, that kind of taps into that question, because it suggests that, we need to be really worried in these situations that stereotypes might undermine these messages of potential and being seen that all of us need. But when we're discredited, right, or categorized, it might be hard to get that message.
Other questions?
wonder if you could say a little bit about your thinking regarding media. And I know that's not your area of emphasis, but it does feel like social media and some of the practices that are central to that genre become practices that are part of everyday interaction, or at least become part of the lexicon of how we engage with others. And that's particularly true for folks who spend a lot of time on social media, which young adults and teenagers do. So thoughts about how that is shaping our interactional practices in face-to-face interaction and shifting or changing what's possible for the kinds of connections that you're describing.
Yeah. There was one study where they found that, it was a large study in the UK where they found that at certain developmental junctures, 11 to 13 for girls, 13 to 15 for boys, that the more they use social media, the lower their well-being later. But then there was actually a little scary additional finding, which was the lower their well-being at that time 2 point, the more they subsequently use social media. So it suggests, this is a bit speculative, but it seems to be the case that when people are feeling threatened, when people don't have that sense of connection, when they're feeling isolated and down, they might use social media as a crutch, which actually turns out, on average, not to be such a healthy thing. It's almost like a little bit of an addiction, has an addictive quality. And I've reviewed the research on this. I think there is some point to that social media is probably one of the culprits for the growing crises in teen mental health, right? Right now, the suicide rate, just to pick one example, of kids aged 10 to 14 has tripled in the past 15 years, just to name one of many. So I do think social media is part of the culprit, one of the culprits from the research. And also just, I have 2 teenage kids. Actually, one just turned 20, so not teenage anymore. But I have seen it kind of firsthand. And I do think that, it can connect kids for sure, but it can also be pretty devastating, I think. What my daughter did was she got off of social media. I just encouraged her, I think, she would maybe not agree, but I encouraged her, let's just experiment, see what life is like without it. So, take it off your phone. I'm not saying don't do it, and she did. And she's like, wow, I feel better. And actually, that's an effect. When people in one study were encouraged to just get off social media, almost, I think it was like 90% said, I feel better. So encouraging the kids, just try it. I'm not going to boss you around, but just try getting off of it. And a lot of times they might discover that they're feeling better as a result. She argued that 2 things that were kind of consistent with the literature. One is that the connections were kind of thin because everyone was presenting a facade, so not a deep connection. That was one problem. The other problem was that it was she realized she was externalizing her self-worth, right? Trying to get those likes, right? And I think that's a big problem too. The kids, their self-worth becomes too externalized as a result of social media. So the addictive quality of it. And the third I thought was really interesting. She had this point that, she's like, I just noticed that all my leisure time was taken up. This time that's supposed to be private became public. And it's probably hard to kind of learn who you are if you're kind of constantly feeling like, if you're constantly on stage. So I would say those 3, that would be my take on social media. I don't know how to get around it. I feel like usage of social media, you can't take the direct route to get kids to sort of use it more wisely or cut down on it. You have to take an oblique approach. You have to kind of help them, experiment with other things, as my daughter did. Get them involved in other things that give them more enduring pleasure, like service, purpose-driven activities, a hobby, a sport. Then they discover, like my son joined a football team, and that was really just kind of brought him into the real world, right, in a way that social media could never do. And also, just a lot of these interventions that we're talking about, I think kids turn to social media when they don't feel seen, they don't feel validated, they don't feel affirmed. There's some work suggesting that actually having a growth mindset, believing that you can grow and change, predicts less social media usage, less problematic social media usage. So those oblique approaches, giving kids kind of these secure bases of well-being, I think a side of that effect of that will be to lower their problematic usage of social media. And as always, just kind of coaching them in wise ways to use it and detecting when it's starting to control them rather than they control it.
Thank you. So as you talk about, creating opportunities to connect, how do you get the individual, well, the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them
Yeah.
drink. How do you gain that responsibility on an employee or a student to take that next step that, hey, we've created all these opportunities to connect, but you have some ownness in that. How do you work through that?
Yeah, well, I don't think any of these practices that we're describing are mollycoddling students. They're like the high standards message. It's like the kids are getting a lot of criticism. So here's a lot of critical feedback. I believe in you, but now it's your game, your move. I think that belonging is to some degree a two-way street, right? We have a responsibility as the people who are in power in an institution to create situations and institutions that are more conducive and create a welcoming space. And then it's partly up to the student to have the will and the desire and the courage. I don't know, now I'm using dispositions. I'm committing the fundamental attribution error as I speak. See, these are so hard to avoid. But some of it depends on the student as well. And I think every student's different. I don't think there's any kind of magic recipe here. So I'm not really sure. But if you're not getting the results you want, I would say two things. One is change takes time. Change takes time. I think in my life, I've been so impressed at the distances people have traveled, both as students, but also across the political divide. But they're not going to change in the immediate conversation, or as soon as I give them feedback, it's going to unfold over time. So patience, I think, comes out of this research as a big virtue. It's almost like people change almost like certain geological phenomena. It's like, the mountains rolling, it just takes more time than you would think. The second thing I would say is to do what Nick Epley calls perspective getting. Perspective getting. If the change isn't happening, ask people what's going on, right? Do what he calls getting perspective. Too often he finds, Nick Epley, we think we can imagine people's point of view, their problems, their perspective, much better than we actually can. And even spouses do this. They get each other wrong. And as a result, we don't take the time to ask, hey, what's going on backstage with you? Are there any problems I need to know about? Do you want to tell me? Can I support you? How can I support you? Getting people's perspective rather than assuming it can actually shine a light on the barriers that are stalling progress. So that active perspective, I know it sounds simple, but these things have amazing, I really believe in the power of asking good questions and listening to the answers. There was a study by two economists, Carol and Iyengar, showing, I'll make a long story short, they wanted to improve first-generation college students' achievement in universities. So they began with perspective getting. They just asked them, hey, how can we make the college experience better for you? And the kids said two things. One, we want more faculty connection with the faculty. And number two, we want tips on how to improve. That's it. Then what the economists did is they went to the instructors at these big university classes and created an intervention. And all the intervention was two emails. The first email was right after the first assignment that said, if you got a B or a C, the email was something like, here's how you can get better. Here are some tips. And by the way, I'm available always. Here are my office hours. Come see me if you want to talk more. And there were one more email after that. And they got these very large effects, bigger than most interventions. Basically, over a full grade point improvement in first-generation college students' performance in these classes. So that's just, and you can imagine, I think a lot of times we just get so frustrated with people because we're like banging at the door. We feel like we're banging at a door and they're not changing. And the problem is we're just using the wrong key to unlock the door. And the way you find the right key is often just to ask people. So that would be my take on that.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Hello.
Hey.
I perhaps would like to, what I'm seeing in the framing of your work is you're really trying to find ways to be of comfort to people on an individual level. When sometimes, and I would invite you to speak to this, what individuals are struggling against are things that are much more systemic and structural. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to address that. And by example, Boulder Valley School District and also general public are pushing back on scholars who teach critical race theory.
Yeah.
So even though we've been invited to do our work here, we are under attack, and there's complicity in the silence of community members who just let the attacks happen. And so a sense of belonging
Yeah.
is not about an individual being nice to me in the hallways. It's
No.
about saying, I am fighting to even do my work here.
Yeah.
So I invite you to go ahead and address that.
I feel so badly about what's happening. I really do. And it's a painful period in our history and in our culture, for sure. I do believe systemic change, structural change, dismantling these systems of exclusion, that is paramount. That is paramount. That is paramount. I'm not sure how we do it, but hopefully we'll do it together. We'll do it together. I think that when we do these studies, for instance, showing the power of a small intervention to change a kid's destiny, ironically sometimes we're shining a light on some of the systemic processes, ironically. I think it happens in two ways. One is, if that note, I believe in you, has such an effect, it does make you wonder, well, wait a minute, why are these kids already getting this message? And you start to think, well, one of the answers is our legacy of discrimination and stereotyping and low expectations for kids from certain groups. So I think that's one way in which the research shines a light on systemic injustice. You wonder about what are the kind of blinders that are affecting the ways in which institutional leaders, like teachers, but also principals, are seeing their children. And I think that, these studies, they're kind of like double-edged sword. They're kind of shining a light on the potential of a little act, but they're also raising these questions like, why isn't this happening more systemically already? Well, there must be a lot of missed opportunities passing these teachers by, passing us all by. So that's one way. The second way I think that these studies shine a light on systemic injustices is this. These domino effects that we find where that little note sends kids off on a different destiny. It's not magic. What usually happens is something like this. The kids do a little bit better. Instead of getting a C+ in the average, they get a B- average. And as a result of getting a B- average in 7th grade, guess what happens? They're not put in the remedial track. And it turns out that the remedial track is an institutional channel through which disadvantage is propagated. That once kids, this is research by Claude Steele and others, when kids are in many of these institutional remedial tracks, it's very hard to get out. And the kids are much less likely to go to college. Just by narrowly avoiding that structural channel, the kids are more likely to make it to college. Now, from one point of view, wow, that's nice that that little intervention is sending kids down a different trajectory. But from another point of view, well, maybe the solution is to get rid of the remedial track. Maybe the solution is to create different kinds of systems that meet kids where they are and try to create opportunity, equal opportunity for all kids, and that don't close the door on their future opportunity. So that would be my two answers to your question. While that the problems that we are facing are really profound. But I think that we can learn a lot by the research that we do. We can learn a lot, down on the ground as individuals, how to kind of fight back in our interactions and encounters, when we're actors in these unjust systems. But then also, at the same time, the most paramount mission is to change the systems themselves. That's what I believe.
Okay, we are at time. And we have an opportunity for the next half hour as well over in the Aspen rooms across the hall for some conversation and additional questions. So we're having a reception across the hall there. And if you want to join us, Dr. Cohen is going to join us for a little bit as well. And just an opportunity to ask more questions on a personal level as well. So I would love it if you would all join me in thanking Dr. Cohen for this talk and for this opportunity to think about these issues together.
Thank you so much, everyone. I had a really wonderful time. Thank you.